Hi, Leo there, neighbors. I'm working on a bit of a thought experiment thing that I thought I'd share with my viewers here. I've been sort of bouncing around an idea for a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting for a while. I like post-apocalypse as a setting in general, and post-apocalyptic fantasy is one of those. It hits the right spot for me. Now, Rifts is the classic post-apocalyptic fantasy game setting. It is amazing in its sort of gonzo, over-the-top nature. It's a shame that the rule system doesn't match up, but the setting is brilliant. So I've been sort of bouncing around this idea for a long time now, ever since 4th edition, of a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting that has that sort of Rift's gonzo-ness without the Rift's terrible rules-ness. And I started revisiting it again recently because I've been thinking about running a Roll20 game soonish. And so I started revisiting some of those old ideas. The base premise is, at some point in the 21st century, something happens that causes a bunch of dimensions to intrude upon the Earth. And these sort of other realities intruding on the Earth causes massive destruction, much like Rifts, but with sort of a different nature to it. Rifts is not the only one to do this. It's been done a few times in a few other ways, but Rifts is the one that sticks out in my head. But basically, it's our world, more than 1,000 years after this, epic disaster turned the world into more of a fantasy world than, the real world we recognize. So, I was trying to think, what I wanted in the setting. I've already decided that there's going to be a nation of technologically advanced ape men who are centered up north and control a good portion of the middle portion of the Midwest of North America. I sort of want the 285 to be this sort of loop that caused a portal over Atlanta to just make Atlanta turn into something terrible for a while. And when it closed, now there's just this sort of blighted wasteland down there inside the 285 loop, where the 285 loop stood. It doesn't stand after 1,000 or 2,000 years, but where it was, and a few other little things. But then I started thinking about something kind of trickier. Religion in a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. It would be easy to just sort of toss in random gods, or I could pull on things from mythology, like, some Norse myth and things like that, and I might still do that. But I was toying with the idea of sort of relating to both pop culture icons and real world religions, to tie in those religions to the ancient past a little bit. I don't want, here's the Christian faith, but I wouldn't mind having, followers of the bleeding God, or something like that, where, yes, it's loosely tied to the old Christianity, but it's not the same thing anymore. I kind of dealt with this notion of priests of essentially priests that follow the idea of the Jedi, even though the Jedi is long forgotten. They still kind of remember that there is this notion of a universal force, and they revere a night protector type god or something. So I was thinking of calling them the Temple of the Order of the Night or something like that. And it might have monks tied to them as well. So I was thinking along those lines, things that sort of tie to things in our world, but the numbers are filed off enough that if you don't explain what they actually were, you might miss what they were originally. Which sounds interesting and a fascinating way to do things, but it also doesn't give you a unified set of pantheon for you to have the guys pull their various gods from. Like if you look at Pathfinder or Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms, while people follow various gods, all those gods sort of exist in the same world, right? They sort of have commonality. They can interact. Eberron's a better example because it has its two sort of directly tied pantheons, and then here's this other religion over here, and here's this one religion over there, and it's a little more like the real world in that regard. And that's the thing I want to go for, but it does mean that I kind of want to also have at least one pantheon-style religion, and I haven't figured out what that would be. I jokingly thought about making it actually based off of Pokemon. The divine saint of Pikachu and Squirtle, and then I came to my senses. But that was an idea that popped into my head. Anyways, this is the thing that's been bouncing around in my head as far as setting creation is coming up with gods. Coming up with gods is hard because if you're playing a D&D game, you're going to want clerics, and clerics need to have gods to tie to. You can do clerics without gods, and it's without any direct god for them to pull on, and that's certainly something I could consider. But it's very much a part of sort of the D&D style world building, and for a gonzo sort of fantasy setting, I wanted to have some. But making gods that are interesting, making religions that are interesting and not perfect, like not utopian, and not so flawed that you look at it and go, why would anybody believe this? But then you think, well, okay, Scientology is a thing, so... But, yeah, I mean, it's something that has been bouncing around in my head today, and I thought I'd share it with people and see what people thought. What would you make for a religion set in a world, 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, when most of the history of the world is more or less forgotten because cities became unlivable for a while and the internet went away, and you might find some old cracked books here and there, but for the most part, a lot of the world we live in now got forgotten. But there's going to be parts that live through as long as people live through. And I was thinking that there'd be some interesting religions that might come out of that. But I'm having a hard time coming up with enough to make it interesting for a gaming setting. Like I could ostensibly go ahead and say, okay, there's only these two religions and call it a day. But I don't think that would be satisfying to people who wanted to have the choices for their clerics or for, just their ordinary characters to follow. Anyway, that's the thing that was bouncing around in my head. Tell me what you think. If you have an idea, if you have a comment, let me know. And, share, subscribe, go check out the Patreon, check back with me tomorrow. I will have something else tomorrow. I may post it early because the annual viewing of the commercials will be happening tomorrow. I'll be over with some friends doing that. So I may record it early and either release it early or release it later at night, but having recorded it during the day. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'll work it out. But anyway, that's what's going on. And have a good night.